Every time Carlos Alcaraz steps onto a tennis court, the broadcast camera cuts to his box. You see the intense focus of Juan Carlos Ferrero. You see his fitness trainers, his physiotherapists, and sitting quietly in the back row, his father, Carlos Alcaraz Sr. For years, the public narrative surrounding the young Spanish phenom was picture perfect. A storybook tale of a prodigy, nurtured by a devoted tennis father in Murcia, polished into a generational champion by a former world #1, and propelled into a multi-million-dollar global brand by elite sports management. It was a machine of perfect alignment, where family, performance, and commercial power appeared to move in flawless, synchronized harmony. Until now, in a candid, explosive commentary that sent shockwaves through the locker rooms of elite tennis, Boris Becker, a man who became a teenage Grand Slam champion himself at 17 and who knows better than anyone the claustrophobic weight of an inner circle, pulled back the curtain on what is truly happening behind closed doors. Becker's claim was direct, unvarnished, and deeply unsettling. Carlos Alcaraz has been forced to take drastic action, actively stripping his father of operational control over his career decisions. To understand why a four-time Grand Slam champion at 22 would make such a painful seismic shift, you have to look past the trophy ceremonies and sponsor photo shoots. You have to look at the quiet psychological friction that builds when a young man, desperate to govern his own destiny, collides with the very parent who built his world from scratch. This is not just a story about tennis. This is a story about power, sovereignty, and the psychological ultimatum every child prodigy must eventually deliver if they want to survive their own success. The architecture of parental control. To appreciate the depth of this fallout, you must first understand what Carlos Alcaraz Sr. meant to his son's early life. Long before Juan Carlos Ferrero ever stepped foot into the picture, Carlos Sr. was the architect, the drill master, and the final authority on every tennis ball his son hit. A former competitive player himself who never quite broke into the elite ranks, Carlos Sr. poured his unfulfilled ambitions and professional expertise into his boy on the cracked hard courts of Murcia. He didn't just support a dream, he engineered a pipeline. He chose the junior tournaments, negotiated early equipment deals, monitored every practice hour, and dictated the rhythm of daily life. In those early years, parental authority and coaching wisdom are completely indistinguishable. A child does not differentiate between a father's love and a manager's schedule. For a decade, Carlos Sr.'s word was absolute law. When Carlos turned 15 and moved to Ferrero's Equalite Academy, a partial transfer of power occurred. Ferrero took over the physical mechanics, the match tactics, and the mental fortitude required for grand stages. But off the court, in scheduling, family governance, financial oversight, and personal lifestyle, Carlos Sr. remained the undisputed patriarch. For a long time, that split dynamic worked seamlessly. The father governed the personal identity. The coach governed the athlete. Together, they built a prodigy who took the ATP Tour by storm, capturing the 2022 US Open, 2 Wimbledon crowns, and becoming the youngest world #1 in tennis history. But as the trophies piled up and the financial stakes exploded into tens of millions of dollars a year, the boundaries between being a protective father and an overbearing executive began to blur beyond recognition. The catalyst, the danger of overprotection. What changed? According to Becker and Tour insiders, the tipping point wasn't a sudden burst of malice or disrespect. It was the suffocating nature of well-intentioned overprotection. A father's primary instinct is to protect his child from harm, burnout, and exploitation. In sports, however, extreme caution can quickly turn into hyper-management. In recent seasons, as Alcaraz dealt with nagging physical setbacks, cramps, abdominal strains, and wrist trouble, the internal debates over his calendar became increasingly volatile. Sources close to the camp suggest that Carlos Sr.'s instinct was often to pull the handbrake. He wanted to pull his son out of tournaments at the slightest hint of physical distress, micromanaging calendar commitments, interfering with recovery protocols, and attempting to dictate which exhibition matches or promotional events were worth the young star's energy. To a father, asking a tournament director for an extension or pulling out of an event is an act of pure parental care. But to a 22-year-old world champion trying to establish his own professional authority, it feels like being treated as a child who cannot speak for himself. Imagine standing on center court at Wimbledon, carrying the hopes of an entire nation, holding millions of dollars in sponsor expectations, and returning to your locker room only to find your schedule, your rest days, and your travel plans being endlessly debated by your father and your coach, as if you weren't even sitting in the room. The tension began to seep into the player's box. Fans and commentators noticed subtle shifts during tight four-set matches, sideway glances during changeovers, tense body language, an underlying anxiety that wasn't about the opponent across the net, but about the warring perspectives sitting in his own corner. Boris Becker saw these warning signs immediately. Having navigated his own complex, suffocating inner circle after winning Wimbledon at age 17, Becker recognized the silent suffering of a young superstar trapped in a gilded cage built by his own family. "When you are 22 years old and a multi-Grand Slam champion," Becker remarked, "you are no longer a boy playing tennis for your father's approval. You are an enterprise. You are an adult. And if your father cannot step back from being the manager, you are forced to make a painful choice, lose your career autonomy, or risk losing the relationship with your father." This was the quiet crisis brewing inside Team Alcaraz, a silent war of sovereignty that was bound to explode the moment the pressure reached a boiling point. It is an uncomfortable truth that tennis history rarely talks about out loud. The very structure that creates a champion is almost always the exact structure that must be demolished for that champion to mature. The early sacrifices of a dedicated parent lay the foundation, but without a clean break, that same foundation quickly becomes a glass ceiling. Carlos Alcaraz found himself staring directly at that ceiling, realizing that every ground stroke he struck was being judged through two completely different lenses: his coach's tactical ambition and his father's instinctual impulse to maintain control over the boy he raised. To see Alcaraz today is to see a player standing at the exact intersection between youthful impulse and adult responsibility. The foundation built by his father gave him the launchpad to reach the stratosphere of international sports. But as the altitude increased, the atmosphere grew thin, and the controls that worked at ground level began to cause severe turbulence. The crack in the foundation was not caused by a failure of love, but by the inevitable weight of an empire that grew too big for a father to rule alone. To fully grasp why Boris Becker's revelation carries such immense weight across the tennis world, one must understand who Boris Becker is to the history of this sport. Becker is not an armchair critic or a sensationalist pundit firing off hot takes from a television studio. He is a man who lived the exact nightmare Alcaraz has been quietly navigating behind closed doors. When Becker won Wimbledon in 1985, as an unseeded 17-year-old, his life was instantly seized by external managers, corporate agents, and an overbearing support system that treated him as a golden commodity rather than a human being. Becker spent the next decade fighting a war to reclaim his identity from the adults who had engineered his rise. When Becker speaks about the psychological claustrophobia of a young champion's inner circle, he speaks with the raw authority of someone who carries the permanent scars of that battle. And what Becker revealed about Alcaraz was a profound, irreversible shift in the power dynamic. Carlos Alcaraz had delivered a definitive ultimatum to his team: the secret psychological war. Behind closed doors, according to insights shared by Becker and confirmed by tour insiders, the dynamic between Carlos Alcaraz and his father had reached a critical breaking point during the grueling grind of the tour. The issue was no longer just about injury timeouts or practice schedules. It was about absolute operational authority. For months, Carlos Sr. had continued to act as a shadow director within the team. He was weighing in on contract renegotiations, attempting to influence travel itineraries, interfering in physical rehab programs, and placing himself in the middle of crucial discussions between Carlos and his primary coach, Juan Carlos Ferrero. Ferrero, a former world #1 and French Open champion, operates on a philosophy of elite professionalism, ruthless discipline, and unyielding accountability. Ferrero's goal has always been crystal clear: turn Carlos into an all-time legend who can stand shoulder to shoulder with Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic. But to achieve that level of sustained excellence across 15 years, a coach needs an athlete who is fully autonomous, someone who takes direct responsibility for his choices, his failures, his fatigue, and his recovery. When a father continuously steps in to cushion the blows, alter the plans, or question the training load, it creates a toxic split in authority. The player is caught in a paralyzing tug-of-war. Do you obey the tactical demands of the former champion who coaches you, or do you defer to the emotional authority of the father who raised you? Alcaraz was suffering from decision fatigue before he even stepped out onto the court. The constant mental micro-adjustments required to appease both sides were draining the electric, joyful energy that defined his game. The signature smile that fans across the globe fell in love with, that infectious, youthful joy of playing tennis, was starting to fade behind a wall of visible frustration and unspoken exhaustion. Stripping operational control. The turning point arrived when Alcaraz realized that his long-term physical and mental survival depended on taking absolute ownership of his career. Stripping his father of operational control was not an act of selfish rebellion, it was a desperate act of professional survival. In concrete, day-to-day terms, what does stripping operational control actually look like inside an elite tennis camp? First, it means completely removing the father from formal scheduling, contract negotiation, and business operations. Commercial obligations, sponsor appearances, tournament entries, and appearance fees are now managed strictly through professional agency channels and direct conversations between Carlos, Ferrero, and his dedicated management team. Carlos Sr. no longer holds a veto power over where, when, or how his son plays. Second, it establishes strict, uncompromising boundaries around the player's box and training sessions, on-court strategy, physical load management, strength conditioning, and medical protocols belong exclusively to Ferrero and the accredited medical staff. The father's role has been intentionally reset to what it should have been all along: a father who offers warmth, emotional groundedness, and unconditional personal support, entirely detached from the cold, calculated business of winning Grand Slams. Third, and most importantly, it shifts the final voice back to Carlos Alcaraz himself. When decisions are made about whether to play through physical discomfort or take extended rest, Carlos is now the one who makes the final call, standing face-to-face with his team as the chief executive officer of his own life and career. The price of independence. Making such a decisive move against Seven is the ultimate rite of passage for any generational athlete. It is the terrifying moment when the child stops seeking parental permission and steps into full adult self-determination. It is a brutal, heart-wrenching process, Becker explained during his breakdown. The father naturally feels rejected because he built the career from day one. He feels like he is being pushed aside after sacrificing his own life for his son's success. But if the son doesn't make that break, the unspoken resentment builds until it destroys both the career and the family relationship forever. Quote, the psychological weight on Alcaraz during this transition was immense. Every uncharacteristic loss, every unforced error, and every moment of court frustration during recent months wasn't just about tactical errors or physical rust. It was the visible friction of a young man fighting for his independence off the court while trying to remain the king of the sport on it. This dynamic is precisely what makes Becker's commentary so resonant. Becker recognized that an athlete's career is often decided long before match point. It is decided in the quiet, agonizing moments when a young player decides whether to remain a grateful child or become a sovereign master. By delivering his ultimatum, Carlos Alcaraz chose sovereignty. He chose to accept the full accountability of his decisions, knowing that if he fails on his own terms, and if he succeeds, the triumph belongs unequivocally to him. With the operational guardrails redrawn and the boundary lines firmly established between family love and professional business, Carlos Alcaraz stands at the threshold of a completely new era in his young career. The secret war that threatened to fracture the interior foundation of his team has yielded to a hard-won, necessary peace. For the first time since he picked up a racket as a skinny kid on a cracked court in Murcia, Carlos Alcaraz is the sole commander of his own destiny. The evolution of Team Alcaraz. What does this newly structured empire look like in practice? It is a leaner, more hyper-professionalized machine. Juan Carlos Ferrero's position as the athletic director of the team has been solidified without shadow governance interference. Ferrero can now implement long-term physical, technical, and strategic plans without having every training block or rest period subjected to emotional parental debate. The management team at IMG and Alcaraz's commercial representatives now report directly to Carlos and his core business advisors, creating a clear corporate buffer that protects both the player's energy and his family's personal harmony. And what of Carlos Sr.? By stepping back from operational logistics, he has been granted something far more valuable than executive authority: the ability to simply be a father again. When Carlos Sr. sits in the player's box now, his burden is fundamentally altered. He no longer sits there as a stressed business manager, calculating ranking points, contract clauses, or schedule conflicts. He sits there as the man who watched his son grow from a small-town dream into a global legend. The emotional pressure valve has been released, allowing the father to celebrate his son's victories and comfort his defeats, without the toxic weight of professional accountability clouding their relationship. This restructuring mirrors the exact path taken by the greatest legends in modern sports history, the blueprint of history. Every iconic champion who sustained excellence across decades had to go through their own version of this operational evolution. Look at Rafael Nadal. While his uncle Tony Nadal coached him with absolute authority during his rise, the Nadal family maintained a clear separation between technical coaching and corporate management. When Uncle Tony eventually stepped aside in 2017, it allowed Rafael to take full ownership of his career's final, triumphant act, without straining the deep family bond that held them together. Look at Roger Federer. In his early 20s, Federer parted ways with early influences and built a streamlined, highly autonomous team structure that gave him complete authority over his schedule and priorities. That autonomy was the very reason Federer was able to play at an elite level well into his late 30s. Look at Novak Djokovic. Djokovic systematically dismantled and rebuilt his inner circle multiple times, redefining his medical team, changing head coaches, and taking absolute control over his physical regimen and tournament commitments. Djokovic realized early on that to survive the brutal physical and mental demands of the ATP Tour, the player must be the absolute dictator of their own life. Carlos Alcaraz is now following this exact historical blueprint. He has recognized that you cannot win 10 or 15 Grand Slams on someone else's terms. You cannot bear the weight of history if you are constantly seeking permission from your corner. The maturity of a sovereign champion. As Alcaraz moves forward into the rest of his career, the broader tennis world is beginning to witness a subtle, yet profound transformation in his on-court presence. The young man who once looked to his box for validation after every missed forehand or lost game is developing a cooler, more self-reliant intensity. His communication with Ferrero during matches is sharper, more tactical, and free from emotional baggage. The signature smile has returned, but it is no longer the wide-eyed innocence of a teenage prodigy. It is the confident, stoic joy of a mature champion who knows exactly who he is and what he represents. The revelation brought to light by Boris Becker extends far beyond Carlos Alcaraz and far beyond the sport of tennis. It is a universal lesson about growth, authority, and the courage required to claim one's own identity. Building an empire requires the help, sacrifice, and guidance of many people: parents, mentors, coaches, and managers. But sustaining an empire requires the courage to take the crown from those who helped build it and place it firmly upon your own head. Carlos Alcaraz didn't push his father away out of disrespect or anger. He pushed him back out of love, necessity, and a fierce determination to ensure that the sport he loves remains his own. The empire behind Carlos Alcaraz is no longer pulling the strings. They are now working for the king. And as the cameras zoom in on those fierce, determined eyes before the first serve of a Grand Slam final, fans can finally be certain of one thing: the decisions are, at long last, his alone. When we look back on the career of Carlos Alcaraz decades from now, this turning point will not be recorded as a scandal or a family rift. It will be remembered as the pivotal chapter where a gifted prodigy shed the protective armor of his upbringing and fully transformed into an autonomous, enduring icon. The empire built around him stands stronger today not because it controls him, but because it finally serves the true intent of the champion within.